In August 2018, a crowd of gamers and journalists in Cologne watched in awe as Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang held aloft a gleaming new graphics card and proclaimed the dawn of real-time ray tracing. On screen, a tech demo showed impossibly lifelike reflections and shadows dancing across a scene, evidence of a graphics technique long considered the holy grail of visuals. Enthusiasts were mesmerized. Tech Radar's Jack Fan later admitted he got sucked into the marketing and splurged $1,200 on an RTX 2080 Ti at launch just to be on the cutting edge. But once the initial fanfare died down, reality set in. That early adopter waited weeks for any game to actually use these futuristic features. When Battlefield 5 arrived as the first RTX-enabled title, he wasn't blown away. The ray-traced reflections looked nice, sure, but turning them on cut his frame rate in half. In fast-paced multiplayer matches, it simply wasn't worth the performance hit for a bit of extra realism. Most other games didn't support Nvidia's new tech at all. Reviewers grew skeptical. The RTX 2080 is poor value today. The cards perform equivalently to a 1080 Ti, and there aren't any applications making use of the namesake feature yet, Gamers Nexus wrote bluntly. In forums, gamers joked that RTX really stood for really experimental technology. Many held off on upgrading, unconvinced that ray tracing, or Nvidia's strange new AI upscaling, was worth the price of entry. Behind the scenes, one company was quietly vindicated by this rocky launch: AMD. Having sat out the ray tracing craze initially, AMD watched Nvidia take the lumps of a first mover, the high costs, the early skepticism, and perhaps felt a tinge of relief. For years, the two GPU rivals had been duking it out over traditional performance, raw frame rates, memory bandwidth, efficiency. Now Nvidia was changing the game, pivoting to new hardware features that few people yet understood. Why risk it? AMD seemingly chose the conservative path, waiting to see if Nvidia's bet would actually pay off or not. After all, if ray tracing turned out to be a fad, AMD could have the last laugh by focusing on cost-effective designs. 7 years later, that moment in 2018 has indeed proven pivotal, just not in AMD's favor. Nvidia's early gamble on specialized GPU hardware has cascaded into a dominant lead, one that has AMD scrambling to catch up even now in 2025. This video asks a simple question. Why is AMD still struggling to match Nvidia in graphics, and when did it truly fall behind? The story spans bold technological bets, public stumbles, corporate strategies, and the relentless march of Moore's law. It's a tale of how doing something first, and doing it early, can create an almost insurmountable advantage. So, how did Nvidia's risky first moves leave AMD in the dust? Let's start at that fateful turning point, the launch of RTX and the divergent paths our two protagonists chose. The GeForce RTX 20 series reveal in 2018 wasn't just another product launch, it was Nvidia essentially declaring a new direction for the entire industry. The flagship RTX 2080 Ti and its smaller siblings were the first gaming GPUs with dedicated RT cores for ray tracing and Tensor Cores for AI inference. On paper, this hardware was built to revolutionize how games are rendered. Ray tracing promised more realistic lighting and reflections by simulating rays of light bouncing around a scene, something that had been limited to Pixar films and high-end 3D rendering farms. And by using Tensor Cores, Nvidia hinted it could apply machine learning to games, from upscale image quality to new AI-driven effects. It was a bold pitch, real-time cinematic graphics, powered by AI. Jensen Huang hyped it to the max, calling RTX the most important Nvidia innovation in a decade, and opening up a new golden age of gaming. AMD's reaction, however, was far more muted. At the time, AMD's latest GPU architecture, known as Vega, was competitive in traditional performance, but lacked any equivalent to Nvidia's new toys. No ray tracing cores, no machine learning silicon. When pressed in interviews, AMD's leadership struck a cautious tone. Lisa Su, AMD's CEO, acknowledged that ray tracing was important technology, but she immediately added a caveat. The consumer doesn't see a lot of benefit today because the ecosystem is not ready. In other words, why rush out specialized hardware if few games supported it? It was, fair to say, AMD was waiting for more software support before diving in, Su admitted. Privately, AMD's engineers were of course working on ray tracing too, but the company was content to be a fast follower rather than the first mover. In hindsight, this was a crucial strategic divergence. Nvidia, with its enormous R&D budget and dominant market share, could afford to take a risk on technology that wasn't quite ready for prime time. The RTX 2080 Ti was a massive 754 square millimeters chip packed with new features and priced accordingly high. Early adopters paid up front for potential rather than immediate payoff. AMD, with far more limited resources, chose a more conservative route: stick to proven designs, deliver value in the here and now, and avoid over-investing in features that gamers weren't asking for yet. In 2018, that seemed reasonable. Nvidia was getting flack for hyping ray tracing that barely anyone could use. Reviewers pointed out that a cheaper GTX 1080 Ti from Nvidia's own previous generation often matched the RTX 2080 in performance unless you turned on ray tracing, in which case even the new 2080 sometimes struggled. No game, no gain, as some quipped about RTX. AMD's decision to hold back, to let Nvidia bleed on the edge, might have felt vindicated in those first months. Indeed, the public reception of RTX was mixed at best. By the end of 2018, only one major game, Battlefield 5, supported ray tracing at all, and using it was so taxing that most players just turned it off. Another early RTX title, Metro Exodus in 2019, showcased beautiful global illumination with ray tracing. The closest I'd seen to what I imagined for the technology, one journalist wrote, but it too required DLSS upscaling to run smoothly. DLSS, Deep Learning Super Sampling, was the other piece of Nvidia's gamble, an AI-powered upscaling technique delivered by those Tensor Cores that could improve performance by rendering at a lower resolution and then enhancing the image with machine learning. The first iteration of DLSS was rough. Images looked blurry and artifacts were common. Digital Foundry and other analysts noted DLSS 1.0 often produced worse visuals than native rendering, hardly the miracle Nvidia had promised. It wasn't until DLSS 2.0 in 2020 that Nvidia's AI upscaling really clicked into place, providing near-native, or sometimes even better than native, image quality with big performance gains. But again, in the 2018 to 2019 timeframe, these benefits were mostly theoretical for gamers. RTX was a solution waiting for a problem, or as Nvidia framed it, an investment in the future of games. So, if you were AMD's management in 2018, you might have felt pretty comfortable with your choice. Let Nvidia experiment while we focus on our strengths. And strengths there were. AMD's GPUs at the time might not have had ray tracing, but they offered plenty of raw performance for the dollar. The Radeon RX Vega and later the Radeon 7, launched in early 2019, didn't topple Nvidia's high-end, but they kept AMD in the game. More importantly, AMD's graphics tech was soon to power the next generation of game consoles. The 2020 PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X would both use custom AMD GPUs. Those chips would eventually include ray tracing support, but AMD knew consoles prioritize cost, efficiency, and broad appeal. Ray tracing on those consoles would be a bonus, not a focus. Indeed, one could argue AMD's strategy was simply aligned with the wider market. Mainstream gamers and console players weren't clamoring for ray-traced reflections or AI upscaling in 2018. They wanted affordable hardware to play Fortnite and Call of Duty at high frame rates. AMD stayed squarely in that lane. All of this set the stage for the coming years. Nvidia had planted a flag on the hill of ray tracing and AI, staking its claim to a future that hadn't arrived yet. AMD quietly scoffed from the sidelines. "We'll join when the time is right." The race was still anyone's to win, or so it seemed. When did AMD truly begin to fall behind? The argument can be made that this was the moment. Not that AMD lost anything yet, but that Nvidia's first-mover advantage clock started ticking here. The full effects wouldn't be felt for a while, but as we'll see, when they did hit, they hit like an earthquake. Nvidia's gamble with RTX was expensive, in silicon, in dollars, and in trust. But it was also visionary. To understand why Nvidia pulled ahead, we have to examine how those early hardware bets, the RT cores and Tensor Cores, paid off over time. It didn't happen overnight. In fact, Nvidia had to iterate and invest for several generations to make good on the RTX promise. When it did, AMD was left in a position that's arguably reactive rather than proactive. Let's break down the two big bets: real-time ray tracing and AI acceleration. First, ray tracing. The concept of ray tracing in graphics has been around for decades. It's how movies achieve photorealistic CGI, tracing billions of rays of light. But doing this in real time, within the 16 milliseconds budget of a single frame at 60 frames per second, was thought to be impossibly out of reach for games. Nvidia's RTX Turing cards in 2018 cracked open that door by adding dedicated RT core hardware to accelerate the math behind ray object intersections and lighting. It was a classic brute force approach. Throw silicon at the problem. The RTX 2080 Ti had 68 RT cores, each capable of handling 10 gigarays per second. Impressive numbers, but in practice that meant maybe a few dozen rays per pixel in a game, enough for basic reflections and shadows, not full-blown path tracing. Still, it was something. Nvidia knew that over subsequent architectures, Ampere, Ada Lovelace, etc., they could ramp this capability further. And crucially, they got the ball rolling with developers. Studios like DICE and 4A Games started experimenting with ray-traced effects, reflections in Battlefield, global illumination in Metro. The RTX development platform provided APIs and tools. Microsoft's DXR added a ray-tracing DXR API as well. By moving first, Nvidia defined the framework and pipeline for ray tracing in games, ensuring that future titles would be built around their hardware. It was a long-game strategy: sacrifice short-term cost performance to establish mindshare and market share for features that would blossom a few years down the road. As one analyst put it in 2018, Nvidia is delivering real-time ray tracing 5 years before we thought possible, a testament to how forward-looking the move was. Secondly, the Tensor Cores for AI. This was even more forward-thinking in some ways. When RTX launched, the primary advertised use of Tensor Cores was DLSS, an AI upscaler to improve frame rates. The first iteration of DLSS 1.0 was essentially a proof of concept and did not impress. But Nvidia didn't abandon it. By 2020, DLSS 2.0 arrived with a new deep learning model that was vastly better. Suddenly, running a game at 4K with DLSS looked almost as good as native 4K, sometimes even slightly sharper due to AI-based anti-aliasing, while boosting performance approximately 30 to 50%. Reviewers were stunned. DLSS is black magic, one enthusiast exclaimed in a forum. It felt like free performance. And because it required those Tensor Core hardware units, it was a unique advantage of Nvidia's RTX cards. AMD had no equivalent, not initially, and not for a while. Beyond DLSS, Nvidia's investment in AI hardware opened the door to a whole new realm of features. Consider all the AI-driven tricks now common in the Nvidia ecosystem. AI-based noise reduction in live streams, RTX voice, AI-enhanced camera backgrounds, broadcast app, deep learning anti-aliasing, DLAA, for higher quality images, and most recently, AI frame generation. More on that later. The Tensor Cores were effectively a parallel processing flex that Nvidia wagered on early. By 2025, this bet not only helped gamers through DLSS, but positioned Nvidia at the center of the machine learning boom. It's ironic but worth noting, the same Tensor Core-rich Nvidia GPUs that gamers use for DLSS are used in data centers to train AI models. That convergence further funds Nvidia's R&D, creating a virtuous cycle of AI prowess that AMD has struggled to match. But we'll stick to gaming for now. Taken together, these hardware bets, ray tracing and AI, created a flywheel effect for Nvidia. Each generation, starting with that tentative RTX 20 series, they have doubled down. The 2020 RTX 30 series, Ampere, brought second-gen RT cores, doubling ray intersection throughput, and third-gen Tensor cores, along with a huge leap in traditional shader performance. Ampere GPUs like the RTX 3080 and 3090 proved that even if you ignored RTX features, Nvidia was still delivering top-tier rasterized performance. But if you did leverage ray tracing and DLSS, the gap between Nvidia and anything AMD had on the market became chasmic. By late 2020, games like Cyberpunk 2077 shipped with ray-traced lighting that could cripple any GPU without dedicated RT hardware. In Cyberpunk's Ultra RT mode, even Nvidia's cards struggled, but AMD's GPUs, lacking ray accelerators in that generation, were effectively unplayable with those effects on. Nvidia's early bet meant that when ray tracing finally hit the mainstream in a marquee title, AMD literally couldn't play. Developers and gamers took note. AMD, for its part, did finally jump in with hardware ray tracing in late 2020. Their RDNA 2 architecture, debuting in Radeon RX 6000 series cards, like the RX 6800 XT and 6900 XT, added ray accelerators, one per compute unit, to perform ray intersection tests. This was AMD's analog to Nvidia's RT cores. In terms of raw capability, it wasn't bad. An RX 6800 XT could do around 4 to 5 gigarays per second, roughly on par with Nvidia's 2018 RTX 2080. The trouble was, by 2020, Nvidia's new RTX 3080 was pushing over 10 gigarays per second with its improved cores. Real-world benchmarks told the story. In Minecraft RTX, which uses full path tracing, Nvidia's RTX 3080 was 80 to 90% faster than AMD's RX 6800 XT. In a broad set of ray-traced games, the RTX 4080, a later Ada card roughly comparable to the 6800 XT's successor, outperformed AMD's flagship by 28 to 36% on ray tracing, on average. This kind of gap was consistent. Generation after generation, Nvidia's lead in ray tracing stayed about a year or two ahead. Nvidia's ray tracing hardware has been superior to AMD's since the beginning, Tom's Hardware observed in 2024, noting that AMD still treated ray tracing as second class and was playing catch-up, content to argue that ray tracing remains non-critical. The non-critical part is key. For a while, AMD's stance, at least in marketing, was that ray tracing wasn't a must-have for gamers, more of a novelty. There's truth to that. Even in 2023, plenty of gamers care more about high frame rates than fancy lighting. But by downplaying the importance of RTX features, AMD may have been underestimating how quickly those features would become commonplace. It's a bit like the transition from DirectX 9 to DirectX 11 era. If one competitor says, "Hey, those new effects aren't that important," while the other one enables game studios to build entire franchises around them, guess who ends up dictating the future? Nvidia's early hardware bet not only gave them a technological lead, it let them shape the conversation. By 2022 to 2023, even budget GPUs were expected to at least support ray tracing. It was a checkbox feature that reviewers and consumers looked for. AMD had to check that box with RDNA 2 and beyond, but Nvidia had already written the exam. the same narrative played out with AI and upscaling. AMD's answer to DLSS didn't arrive until mid-2021 with Fidelity FX Super Resolution, FSR. And FSR 1.0 was a much simpler tech, a spatial upscaler with no temporal component, definitely no machine learning, basically an advanced post-process filter. It helped boost performance a bit, but image quality was nowhere near DLSS 2.0's level. Over time, AMD improved this. FSR 2.0 in 2022 moved to a temporal algorithm, leveraging past frames like DLSS, and looked much better. Crucially, FSR had one big advantage. It was open and GPU agnostic. You could use FSR on Nvidia and even Intel GPUs, and AMD made the tech open source. This meant many games adopted FSR simply because it could cater to a wider audience, including consoles in some cases. By sheer numbers, FSR support grew quickly. But whenever the head-to-head comparison of FSR versus DLSS came up, the verdict tended to favor Nvidia. FSR falls behind DLSS in almost every image quality category, considerably more fuzziness, reported Digital Foundry in one analysis. In motion and fine detail, DLSS's trained neural nets preserved clarity better, while FSR's algorithm sometimes struggled with aliasing and shimmer. And because Nvidia had the hardware acceleration, those Tensor Cores, they could also run the upscaling with less performance overhead. One comment summed it up. DLSS is objectively better than FSR. FSR is just more compatible. DLSS quality beats out a lot of forms of anti-aliasing. In other words, AMD's choice to avoid proprietary AI hardware yielded a more inclusive tech, but at the cost of ultimate quality. Another area Nvidia's first-mover advantage manifested was DLSS frame generation, introduced with RTX 40 series in 2022, marketed as DLSS 3. This feature generates entirely new intermediate frames using AI, effectively doubling frame rates in CPU-bound or extremely GPU-bound scenarios. It was a bit mind-bending. The GPU creates fake frames to insert between real ones, boosting smoothness at the expense of a bit of added latency. Again, early reactions were mixed. Some called it wizardry, others worried about increased input lag or occasional visual artifacts. But Nvidia iterated, adding reflex to minimize latency and improving the AI model. By 2023, DLSS 3.5's frame generation was fairly mature, and many high-profile games, from Forza Horizon to Diablo 4, enabled it. AMD was, once more, on the back foot. They announced their equivalent, FSR 3, with frame generation, over a year later. It finally launched in late 2024 on a handful of titles. And while it was great to see an open-source alternative, the pattern repeated. FSR 3's frame generation worked on more GPUs, even Nvidia's ironically, but it didn't work as well. Technical reviews found that FSR 3's interpolated frames had more judder and latency issues, especially with variable refresh rate displays. AMD even recommended running with VSync and at very high FPS to hide the frame pacing woes. Moreover, the overall experience required more fiddling to get right. The direct alternative just works, as one TechSpot editor put it, referring to DLSS 3's more plug-and-play nature. On image quality, FSR 3's generated frames were commendable. It even handled UI elements better than Nvidia in some cases, but still not quite as good as DLSS 3 on fine details and extreme motion. All these comparisons drive home a simple truth. Nvidia's multi-year head start with specialized hardware and corresponding software gave them a compounding advantage. Each generation they weren't just improving raw horsepower, they were also refining these features, RT, DLSS, that AMD was one step behind on. By the time AMD fielded an answer, Nvidia often had moved to the next iteration. To be fair to AMD, catching up on these fronts is incredibly challenging. It's not just flipping a switch. Ray tracing performance, for example, relies on lots of architectural choices: BVH traversal logic, cache systems, intersection throughput. You can't magically bolt on 3 years of Nvidia learnings overnight. Similarly, machine learning upscaling involves expertise in both hardware, matrix math units, and software, neural network training, and image reconstruction algorithms. AMD's GPU division historically did not focus on AI workloads. They were more tied to classic graphics pipelines and OpenCL compute for HPC. By the time AMD realized how key AI upscaling would be, Nvidia had an entire ecosystem and developer mindshare built around CUDA and Tensor Cores. The first mover doesn't just get a product out, they get inside developers' heads, they set standards, they attract talent skilled in that domain. Nvidia did that with AI and graphics. A vivid anecdote that illustrates this. Quake 2 RTX. In 2019, Nvidia engineers in their spare time helped fully path trace the 1997 game Quake 2 and released it as a free showcase. It was stunning, a retro shooter reborn with realistic lighting. Running it brought even a $1,200 RTX card to its knees, but it proved what path tracing could do. Quake 2 RTX was a revelation, wrote TechRadar's PC gaming editor, saying he never thought a lighting engine could so completely transform a familiar game. It was the kind of demo that sold the idea of RTX, even if the performance wasn't there yet to make it mainstream. AMD had no equivalent wow moment project. By the time they got hardware capable of similar feats, Nvidia's experiments like Quake 2, Minecraft RTX, and Portal RTX, released in late 2022 with full path tracing that effectively requires DLSS 3 to be playable, had already convinced much of the industry that this is the way forward. In short, Nvidia set the agenda. AMD had to follow.